The gravel bit into Sarah Whitmore's knees as she collapsed on Red Hollow Road, 6-month-old Grace wailing in her arms. The sun blazed overhead, merciless. Her black mourning dress, still worn from Ethan's funeral a week ago, gathered dust as she tried to shield her baby from the heat. Cars passed, 1, 2, 3, their occupants turning away from the widow, begging with her eyes. That morning, Dorothy Whitmore had shattered her world with 7 words. "My son is dead. This isn't your house anymore. No warning, no mercy. Just a diaper bag thrown at her feet." The asphalt shimmered ahead. Grace's cries grew weaker. Then, through the dust, a pickup truck slowed down. 7 days had passed since they lowered Ethan Whitmore into the ground, and the house on Maple Street still smelled like funeral flowers. Wilted lilies turning brown at the edges, their sickly sweet perfume clinging to the curtains. Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost herself, Grace bundled against her chest in a faded cotton wrap. The baby had Ethan's eyes, pale blue, searching. Every time Sarah looked at her daughter, her throat closed. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Grace's occasional whimpers. Dorothy Whitmore sat in the living room, rigid as the mahogany chair beneath her, her silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of displeasure. She hadn't spoken to Sarah since the burial, hadn't even looked at Grace. Before we continue this powerful story, if you're enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. We're working to reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you emotional, dramatic stories like Sarah's journey. Your support means everything. That morning, Sarah had woken to find Dorothy standing in the nursery doorway. The older woman's face was carved from stone, her thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. "Come downstairs," she'd said, then turned without waiting for a response. Sarah had dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she buttoned Grace's onesie, the yellow one with tiny ducks that Ethan had picked out 3 months before the accident. The living room felt colder than the rest of the house. Though the thermostat read 72 degrees, Dorothy stood by the window, her back to Sarah, her spine a rigid line beneath her black cardigan. When she finally turned, her eyes were dry. Too dry, as if she'd decided tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. "My son is dead." The words landed like stones in still water. Dorothy's voice didn't waver, didn't crack. This house was his. The mortgage, the deed, everything carries the Whitmore name. She paused, her gaze sliding past Sarah to settle somewhere on the wall behind her. "You were married to him for 3 years. That doesn't make you family." Sarah's arms tightened around Grace instinctively. The baby squirmed, sensing tension in her mother's body. "Dorothy, please, this isn't your house anymore." Dorothy crossed the room to the front door and opened it. Morning light spilled across the hardwood floors Ethan had refinished last spring. "There's nothing here for you now." The words should have shocked her, should have felt sudden, violent, but Sarah realized with a cold clarity that settled in her bones that she'd been waiting for this moment since they'd closed the casket. Dorothy had never approved of the marriage, the mechanic's daughter who'd trapped her successful son with an unexpected pregnancy. At least that's how Dorothy told it at family dinners, her voice dripping with honeyed poison. "I have nowhere to go." Sarah hated how small her voice sounded, how it trembled at the edges. "That's not my concern." Dorothy walked to the coat closet and pulled out a faded diaper bag, the one Sarah's mother had sent when Grace was born. She dropped it on the floor between them. "Take what you can carry." Sarah stood frozen, Grace's warm weight against her chest the only thing tethering her to reality. This couldn't be happening. People didn't do things like this, not to widows, not to babies. But Dorothy's face was set, her hand still gripping the doorknob, and Sarah understood with perfect, terrible clarity that no amount of pleading would change what was happening. She gathered what she could in 15 minutes. Diapers, formula, a change of clothes for Grace, a sweater for herself. Her hands moved automatically while her mind spun in useless circles. Call someone. But who? Her mother had passed 2 years ago. Her father had disappeared when she was 7. Ethan had been her entire world, and now that world had collapsed into the space of a diaper bag. Dorothy watched from the doorway as Sarah walked down the porch steps, each board creaking under her feet. the third one from the bottom that Ethan had promised to fix. The morning was already hot, the July sun climbing toward its brutal midday peak. Sarah turned back once, hoping to see some crack in Dorothy's armor, some hint of the grandmother who should have been protecting her granddaughter. But Dorothy was already closing the door. Red Hollow Road stretched before Sarah like an accusation. The asphalt shimmered with heat, and on either side, fields of corn stood tall and indifferent. She walked because there was nothing else to do, one foot in front of the other, Grace's weight growing heavier with each step. The diaper bag cut into her shoulder. Sweat gathered at her temples, traced lines down her spine. A car approached from behind, and Sarah's heart leaped with desperate hope. She turned, raising her free hand, but the sedan, Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, slowed only slightly before accelerating past. Sarah caught a glimpse of the woman's face through the window. Recognition, then a quick averting of eyes, as if poverty and desperation were contagious. Grace began to cry, a thin, exhausted wail that cut through the summer air. Sarah sank to her knees at the roadside, the gravel biting through her dress, and did the only thing she could. She held her daughter close and whispered promises she didn't know if she could keep. That's when she heard the engine slowing down behind her. A different sound, deeper, the rumble of something built for work rather than comfort. What happens when Caleb Harlan steps out of that truck? Will he be another person who drives past Sarah's suffering? Or could this stranger change everything? The pickup truck's engine rumbled closer, then fell silent. Sarah didn't look up. She couldn't bear to see another face turn away, couldn't stomach another pair of eyes sliding past her, like she was something dirty on the roadside. Grace's cries had weakened to exhausted hiccups against her chest, each small gasp a knife in Sarah's heart. Boots crunched on gravel, heavy, deliberate steps. Then they stopped. "Mom." The voice was deep, weathered, a man who'd spent years speaking over wind and machinery. "You hurt?" Sarah's head lifted slowly. The sun blazed behind him, turning his figure into a dark silhouette haloed in brutal light. She squinted, trying to make out his features, but all she could see was the outline of broad shoulders, worn jeans, and work boots caked with red clay. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, tasting dust. "We're fine." It was such an obvious lie that saying it out loud felt like another small death. She wasn't fine. Grace wasn't fine. Nothing about this day, this week, this life was fine. But pride, that last worthless scrap of it, made her straighten her spine even as she knelt in the dirt. The man shifted his weight. She heard the creak of worn leather, maybe a belt or boots. "That baby needs shade." Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact delivered in a tone that suggested he'd already decided what came next. Before Sarah could respond, he moved past her to the truck bed. She heard the scrape of metal, the rustle of canvas. When he returned, he was carrying a faded tarp and 2 bottles of water. He spread the tarp to create a small triangle of shade against the truck's side, anchoring it with rocks from the roadside. "Sit here." He held out a water bottle. His face was clearer now, weathered skin, lines carved deep around eyes that were a startling green against his sun-darkened face, dark hair streaked with grey at the temples, somewhere in his late 40s, maybe 50. "Drink. Then we'll figure out where you're headed." Sarah crawled into the shade, her legs trembling. The relief from the sun's assault was immediate and overwhelming. She unscrewed the water bottle with shaking hands and drank, the liquid cool and perfect, sliding down her parched throat. Grace stirred against her, making small mewling sounds. "She needs to eat," Sarah whispered, reaching for the diaper bag. The man, Caleb Harlan, though she didn't know his name yet, turned his back without being asked, giving her privacy as she arranged Grace for feeding. He stood between them and the road, his body a wall blocking the view of any passing cars. It was such a simple gesture, but Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Kindness, she'd learned in the past week, could hurt worse than cruelty because it reminded you of everything you'd lost. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by Grace's contented nursing sounds and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. A car passed. Sarah recognized the engine sound, Tommy Brennan's old Chevy, but Caleb's presence seemed to shield them from curious eyes. When Grace finished eating, Sarah burped her gently and adjusted her own dress. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We'll be okay now." Caleb turned around, his expression unreadable. "Where you headed?" The question hung in the shimmering air. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. Where was she headed? The truth was nowhere. She had nowhere to go, no family, no friends who hadn't vanished the moment Dorothy started spreading poison about her at church socials and town gatherings. "I have family in the next town." The lie tasted bitter. Caleb's eyes, those unsettling green eyes, studied her face for a long moment. Then he glanced at the diaper bag, at her dusty dress, at the way Grace's onesie was slightly too small, pulling at the snaps. When he looked back at Sarah, she saw something in his expression shift. "No, you don't. Not cruel. Just certain." Sarah's face burned. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, unable to defend herself with more lies. Grace chose that moment to reach up and grab a handful of her mother's hair, tugging with the mindless joy of a baby who didn't understand that their world had shattered. "I recognize you," Caleb said after a moment. "You're Ethan Whitmore's wife. Widow, I mean." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "I heard about the accident. Logging truck jackknifed on Route 9. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Dorothy Whitmore's your mother-in-law." Another nod. Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. He looked down the road toward town, then back at Sarah. Something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "She put you out." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "The house was his, I have no legal claim." The words had become a mantra, something she'd told herself over and over as she'd packed that pathetic diaper bag. Legal claim. Caleb repeated the words like they tasted foul. He shook his head slowly, then crouched down so he was eye level with Sarah. That woman buried her son a week ago, and today she threw his widow and baby out onto the street in 90-degree heat. Hearing it said aloud, stated so plainly, stripped of all the complicated feelings and guilt Sarah had wrapped around it, made something crack open in her chest. Yes, that was exactly what had happened. That was the simple, terrible truth of it. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sarah whispered, and it was the first honest thing she'd said all day. Caleb stood, looking down at her and Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. He seemed to be weighing something, turning over a decision that mattered more than she could understand. The hawk cried again overhead, circling in the thermal currents. Finally, he spoke. "You can't stay here on this road. Sun gets worse before it gets better, and night brings other problems." He paused. "I have a proposition for you, but you might not like it." What could a stranger possibly offer that wouldn't come with strings attached? And why would Sarah, desperate, alone, with nowhere else to turn, even consider trusting him? Sarah's stomach tightened at Caleb's words. A proposition. She'd heard those before, offers that came wrapped in concern but unraveled into expectations no desperate woman should have to meet. Her arms instinctively tightened around Grace, who made a small sound of protest. "I run a farm about 4 miles west of here," Caleb continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Corn, soybeans, some cattle. I have workers who help during harvest season, and a main house that's too big for one person." He paused, watching her face carefully. "I'm offering you a room. Not in the barn or the worker housing. In the main house." Sarah stared at him, trying to process the words. "I don't understand." "It's not complicated." Caleb pulled off his worn baseball cap and ran a hand through his hair before replacing it. "You need a place to stay. I have space. You and the baby can have a room until you figure out what comes next." The offer was so unexpected, so incomprehensible, that Sarah's mind struggled to find the trap, because there had to be a trap. People didn't just offer strangers rooms in their homes, especially not widows found collapsed on roadsides with babies in their arms. "Why would you do that?" Her voice came out sharper than intended, edged with suspicion born from Dorothy's cruelty and this town's collective indifference. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Because that baby's 6 months old, it's 95 degrees, and you've got nowhere to go." He said it like those facts alone were reason enough, as if basic human decency wasn't something that required lengthy explanation. "You don't know me." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I could be—" "You could be what? Dangerous?" A hint of something that might have been humor flickered across his weathered face. "Ma'am, you collapsed on a roadside with a baby. I'm not worried about my safety." Grace chose that moment to grab at Sarah's collar, babbling nonsense syllables that sounded almost like questions. The innocent sound highlighted the absurdity of Sarah's protests. What choice did she have? Walk further down this endless road toward nothing? Sleep in a ditch with her daughter? There's got to be something you want in return. She had to say it, had to name the fear coiling in her gut. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something like anger flash in those green eyes. "I'm not that kind of man." The words carried weight, an edge of steel beneath the drawl. "You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. You'll eat at the table with me and the workers. You'll help out if you're able, cooking, cleaning, whatever you can manage with a baby. That's it. That's the arrangement." Sarah's throat burned. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe that someone in this cruel world might offer help without strings attached, but trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "How long?" she whispered. "As long as you need." Caleb's voice softened slightly. "Until you get on your feet. Find work, save money, whatever that takes." The hawk's cry echoed overhead again, and Sarah looked up at the endless blue sky, cloudless and indifferent. Heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves. Grace's diaper was probably wet, and the formula in the bag would spoil soon in this heat. The practical concerns stacked up against her fear, tipping the scales toward a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay. If you're moved by Sarah's story and want to see what happens next, please hit that subscribe button. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue bringing powerful, emotional stories like this one. Every subscription matters." Caleb nodded once, as if her acceptance settled something in his mind. He helped her to her feet, careful not to jostle Grace, then folded the tarp and loaded it back into the truck bed. The interior of the cab smelled like coffee, leather and something earthy. Soil, maybe, or hay. Sarah climbed in awkwardly, adjusting Grace on her lap while Caleb secured the diaper bag behind the seat. The engine rumbled to life, and they pulled onto Red Hollow Road heading west, away from town and Dorothy's poisonous reach. Sarah watched the familiar landmarks slide past: the abandoned gas station, the church where they'd held Ethan's funeral, the turn-off to Maple Street, where her entire married life had existed and ended. "People in town know you're doing this?" she asked after a few minutes of silence. "Don't much care what people know." Caleb kept his eyes on the road, his large hands relaxed on the steering wheel. "I do what seems right. Let folks talk if they want." They turned off the main road onto a gravel drive marked by a weathered wooden sign, Harlan Farm East, 1987. Fields stretched out on either side, corn on the left standing tall and green, soybeans on the right rippling in the breeze. In the distance, a large farmhouse rose against the horizon, white clapboard siding with a wraparound porch and a red tin roof that caught the afternoon sun. As they approached, Sarah saw 3 men working near a large barn, loading equipment onto a trailer. They stopped when Caleb's truck pulled up, their faces curious and guarded. Caleb parked and climbed out, gesturing for Sarah to wait a moment. She watched through the dusty windshield as he approached the men. Their conversation was too quiet to hear, but she saw their reactions: surprise, skepticism. One man shaking his head slowly. Caleb spoke again, his posture firm, and whatever he said made the men exchange glances before nodding reluctantly. He returned to the truck and opened Sarah's door. "Come on, let's get you inside." The farmhouse was cool and dim after the brutal sunlight, the air scented with lemon polish and something baking. Bread, maybe, or biscuits. The interior was neat, but lived in. Hardwood floors worn smooth by years of boots, furniture that was sturdy rather than stylish, family photos on the mantel that Sarah didn't let herself examine too closely. "Guest rooms upstairs. Second door on the right," Caleb said, leading her through the house. "Bathrooms across the hall. Towels in the linen closet. There's a crib in the attic. My daughter used it years ago. I'll bring it down and set it up. His daughter. The words caught Sarah's attention, but before she could ask, he was already climbing the stairs. She followed, Grace heavy in her tired arms, each step requiring effort her exhausted body barely had left to give. The guest room was simple but clean, a double bed with a blue quilt, a dresser, a window overlooking the soybean fields, lace curtains stirring in the breeze from an oscillating fan. After the chaos of the morning, the simple orderliness of it made Sarah's eyes sting with unshed tears. "I'll get that crib," Caleb said from the doorway. "You rest. Dinner's at 6. Just come down when you hear voices." He left before Sarah could thank him, his boots heavy on the stairs. She sank onto the bed, Grace still clutched against her chest, and for the first time since Dorothy had opened that door and destroyed her world, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. But kindness from strangers always comes with questions. What secrets does Caleb Harlan carry in that big farmhouse, and can Sarah really trust a man she just met on the roadside? Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the low of cattle in distant pastures, the mechanical whir of irrigation systems, boots on gravel below her window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory crashed back. Dorothy's cold voice, the burning road, Caleb's unexpected offer. She turned her head to see Grace sleeping peacefully in the wooden crib, her small chest rising and falling in the dim morning light, filtering through lace curtains. The clock on the dresser read 5:47 a.m. Sarah had slept longer than she had in months, true, dreamless sleep born from complete exhaustion. Her body ached as she stood, muscles protesting the previous day's ordeal. Grace stirred but didn't wake, her tiny fist curled near her mouth. Voices drifted up from downstairs, male voices, rough with early morning gravel, punctuated by the clink of dishes and the smell of coffee so strong Sarah could almost taste it. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She changed Grace's diaper quietly, dressed her in the only clean onesie left in the bag, then steeled herself for whatever awaited below. The kitchen was warm and bright, sunlight streaming through windows over a deep farmhouse sink. 3 men sat at a large wooden table scarred with decades of use, plates piled with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of toast. They fell silent when Sarah appeared in the doorway, Grace balanced on her hip. Caleb stood at the stove, spatula in hand, looking surprisingly domestic in worn jeans and a faded blue work shirt. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's on the counter, mugs in the cabinet above. Take a seat. Breakfast is almost ready." The 3 men shifted uncomfortably. One of them, young with sandy hair and sunburned cheeks, started to stand. "Ma'am, you can have my chair." "She'll sit here." Caleb pulled out a chair at the head of the table, across from his own seat. The gesture was simple but significant. He was placing her in a position of respect, not relegating her to the margins. The young man sat back down, looking relieved. Sarah poured coffee one-handed, Grace growing heavier by the second, then settled into the offered chair. The men returned to their breakfast, but kept sneaking glances at her, curious, uncertain, trying to figure out what her presence meant. Caleb slid a plate in front of her, eggs cooked perfectly over easy, crispy bacon, toast with butter melting into golden pools. "You need anything for the baby?" he asked. "High chairs in the pantry if she's old enough." "She's only 6 months, still nursing mostly." Sarah's face warmed. These were intimate details, strange to discuss with a table full of men. "Formula in the bag getting low?" Caleb's question was practical, not intrusive. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'll pick some up in town later. Write down what brand she takes." He returned to his own seat and began eating with the efficient movements of someone who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure. The young sandy-haired man cleared his throat. "I'm Marcus, ma'am. This here's James and Miguel." He gestured to the others, James older with grey-streaked beard, and Miguel dark-eyed and quiet. "We work the farm during growing season." "Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Whitmore." Recognition flickered across their faces. They'd heard about Ethan's death then, probably heard about Dorothy too. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues. "Your husband was a good man," James said gruffly. "Fixed my truck transmission last year for half what the dealership wanted. I'm sorry for your loss." The unexpected kindness made Sarah's throat tighten. "Thank you." They finished breakfast in relative silence, the men rising to scrape plates and rinse dishes with practiced efficiency. Marcus paused at the door. "Boss, we're starting on the north irrigation today. Should be done by afternoon if the parts hold." Caleb nodded. "I'll be out after I run to town." When the men filed out, their voices fading toward the barn, Sarah found herself alone with Caleb and the morning sunlight and the strange intimacy of shared space. Grace babbled softly, reaching for a spoon on the table. "They're good people," Caleb said, collecting the last of the dishes. "They know not to gossip. What happens here stays here." Sarah watched him move through the kitchen with surprising grace for such a large man, his movements economical and sure. "Why are you doing this?" The question had haunted her all night. "Really? People don't just help like this?" Caleb stopped at the sink, his back to her. For a long moment he didn't answer. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. A fly buzzed against the window screen. "I had a daughter once," he finally said, his voice low and careful, like he was handling something fragile. "Emma. She was born premature, too early, the doctors said. Lived 3 days. He turned on the faucet, the rush of water filling the silence. "My wife, Catherine, she never recovered from it. Not really. She got sick a few years later. Cancer. By the time they found it, there was nothing to do but wait." Sarah's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry. That was 8 years ago." Caleb's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I learned something in those years. Learned that grief is a room you can live in forever, if you're not careful. And I learned that when you see someone drowning, you don't ask questions. You just pull them out." He turned to face her, his green eyes steady and sad in a way that suggested old wounds never quite healed. "Yesterday, I saw a mother on the side of the road with a baby. Nobody stopping, nobody helping. And all I could think was, what if that had been Catherine and Emma? What if they'd needed help and everyone just drove past?" The raw honesty in his voice stripped away Sarah's remaining defenses. This wasn't about charity or pity. This was about a man haunted by what-ifs, trying to rewrite a story he couldn't change by changing someone else's ending. "That baby," Caleb continued, nodding toward Grace, "she didn't ask to be born into this situation. Didn't ask for her father to die or her grandmother to be cruel. She's innocent in all of it. And I don't let innocent things suffer when I can do something about it." Grace chose that moment to laugh, a pure, delighted sound that filled the kitchen with unexpected joy. She'd grabbed the spoon and was waving it like a conductor's baton, pleased with her accomplishment. Caleb's expression softened, something painful and tender crossing his weathered face. "She's got your smile," he said quietly. "She has Ethan's eyes," Sarah whispered back. They stood there in the morning light, two people carrying different griefs, but understanding the weight of them, and for the first time since the funeral, Sarah felt like she could breathe without the air turning to glass in her lungs. But peace in small towns is fragile, and Dorothy Whitmore wasn't the type to let go easily. What would happen when word reached her that her granddaughter was living under Caleb Harlan's roof? 3 weeks passed like a careful exhale, quiet days filled with the rhythm of farm life, Grace's gurgling laughter, and the slow rebuild of something Sarah had thought was permanently broken, hope. She fell into routines without realizing it. Morning coffee with Caleb and the workers, afternoons spent in the garden with Grace on a blanket beside her, evenings rocking the baby while the sun set over soybean fields that stretched toward forever. The men had stopped treating her like a curiosity. Marcus taught her how to collect eggs from the henhouse without spooking the chickens. Miguel showed her which herbs grew wild near the creek. Even James, gruff and weathered, carved a small wooden rattle for Grace that the baby immediately tried to eat. Sarah cooked dinners, simple things at first, then more elaborate, as Caleb's pantry revealed itself to be surprisingly well-stocked. Pot roasts, cornbread. Apple pie made from fruit picked from gnarled trees behind the barn. She didn't let herself think too far ahead. Tomorrow was enough. Next week felt impossibly distant. The future was a country she couldn't afford to visit yet. But the past, as it always does, came looking for her. It was a Thursday afternoon, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain, when Sarah heard the car engine on the gravel drive. She was folding laundry in the living room, Grace asleep in the portable playpen Caleb had bought in town. The sound made her stomach drop. She knew that engine, the particular rattle of a loose belt that Ethan had promised to fix but never got around to. Dorothy's Buick. Sarah moved to the window, her hands gripping the curtain so hard her knuckles went white. The silver car pulled up in front of the house, dust settling around it like an accusation. Dorothy emerged in a black dress that seemed to swallow light, her silver hair perfect despite the humidity. Her face set in that expression Sarah knew too well, righteous anger wrapped in a veneer of civility. The front door was unlocked. Caleb was in the north field checking irrigation lines. The workers were at the equipment shed. Sarah was alone. Dorothy didn't knock. She walked up the porch steps like she owned them, opened the screen door, and stepped into the living room as if she'd been invited. Her eyes swept the space, taking in the comfortable furniture, the family photos, the basket of freshly folded laundry, Grace sleeping peacefully in the playpen. So it's true. Dorothy's voice was ice wrapped in silk. My granddaughter is living in a stranger's house. Sarah forced herself to straighten, to meet those cold eyes. Grace is safe. She's fed, clean, and cared for. That's more than you offered. Don't you dare. Dorothy's composure cracked, her voice rising. Don't you dare stand there and judge me. I lost my son, my only child. And you trapped him with that pregnancy, dragged him down from the life he could have had. I loved him. Sarah's voice shook, but held firm. I loved Ethan, and he loved me. Love. Dorothy spat the word like poison. You were a mechanic's daughter with no prospects and a pretty face. You saw a way out and you took it. The words landed like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to erase. Sarah had heard variations of this speech before. At family dinners, whispered behind hands at church, in the tone of Dorothy's voice, every time she introduced Sarah to friends as Ethan's wife, with that particular emphasis that made it sound like a temporary condition. If you believe that, Sarah said quietly, why did you throw us out? If Grace is Ethan's daughter, your blood, why didn't you want her? Dorothy's face twisted, something ugly and raw breaking through her carefully maintained facade. Because every time I look at that child, I see him. I see my son and I remember he's gone and it's too much. Do you understand? It's too much. The honesty was unexpected, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw past the cruelty to the grief beneath, a mother's pain so overwhelming it had curdled into something toxic. But understanding didn't erase the harm, didn't change the fact that Dorothy had chosen her own comfort over her granddaughter's safety. Then why are you here? Sarah asked. Because people are talking. Dorothy's mask slammed back into place. Talking about my daughter-in-law living with Caleb Harlan, alone, unchaperoned. Do you have any idea what that looks like? It looks like survival, Sarah shot back. It looks like a man offering help when no one else would. It looks like scandal. Dorothy moved closer, her perfume, expensive, suffocating, filling the space between them. It looks like a widow who couldn't wait to find the next man's bed to warm. The accusation hung in the air, vile and deliberate. Sarah's face burned with anger and shame, not because the words were true, but because she knew others were thinking the same thing. In small towns, kindness between men and women was always interpreted through the lens of sin. Nothing like that is happening here, Sarah said through gritted teeth. Doesn't matter if it is or isn't. What matters is what people believe. Dorothy's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. And they believe you've disgraced my son's memory. That you've shamed the Whitmore name. The Whitmore name, Sarah repeated slowly. The name you threw out onto the street with a diaper bag and no warning. Grace stirred in the playpen, making small sounds that meant she'd wake soon. Both women's eyes went to the baby, Sarah's filled with protective love, Dorothy's with something harder to read. Longing, maybe, or regret, or just the pain she'd admitted to, too raw to examine. Come back, Dorothy said suddenly, the words forced out like she was choking on them. Come back to the house, you and Grace. We'll tell people you were visiting family. We'll smooth this over. Sarah stared at her mother-in-law, searching for sincerity and finding only calculation. Dorothy didn't want them back. She wanted to control the narrative, to save face, to prove to the town that she wasn't the villain in this story. No. The word came out stronger than Sarah expected. Dorothy's face hardened. You'll regret this. Maybe. Sarah moved to the playpen, positioning herself between Dorothy and Grace. But at least my daughter will grow up knowing that when I had to choose between shame and safety, I chose her. The screen door banged open. Caleb stood in the doorway, his work shirt dark with sweat, his expression dangerous in a way Sarah had never seen. Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you should leave. Dorothy turned, sizing him up with a look that could strip paint. This is family business. This is my house. Caleb's voice was quiet but absolutely certain. And you're not welcome here. You're interfering in matters that don't concern you. A woman and baby under my roof, that concerns me plenty. He held the door open, making his meaning clear. You've said your piece. Time to go. Dorothy looked between them, her face flushed with rage and something that might have been fear. Fear of losing control, of being irrelevant, of being seen as the cruel woman she'd become. She gathered her purse, her dignity, her venom. This isn't over, she said, directing the words at Sarah. But as she walked out and her Buick's engine faded down the gravel drive, Sarah realized with startling clarity that it was over. Whatever power Dorothy had held over her, the fear, the obligation, the desperate need for family even when that family was poisonous, it had broken the moment Sarah said no. Caleb closed the door and turned to her. You okay? Sarah picked up Grace, who was fully awake now and reaching for her mother's face with sticky fingers. I think I am, she said, and meant it. Dorothy Whitmore doesn't accept defeat easily, but sometimes the hardest battles aren't against the people who hurt us. They're against our own belief that we deserve the hurt. Can Sarah truly build a new life, or will the weight of judgment drag her back down? Summer surrendered to autumn, in a slow cascade of gold and crimson, the fields transforming from green abundance to harvested stubble. Sarah watched the seasons change from the farmhouse porch, Grace balanced on her hip, now pulling herself up on furniture and babbling strings of almost words that sounded like questions about the world she was discovering. 4 months had passed since Dorothy's visit. 4 months of silence from the woman who'd once dominated every corner of Sarah's life. The town had talked, of course, whispers at the grocery store, pointed looks at church on the rare occasions Sarah ventured there with Caleb. But the whispers couldn't touch her here, couldn't penetrate the walls of the life she was building one careful day at a time. She'd found work, nothing grand, just helping Mrs. Chen at the farmer's market on weekends, selling vegetables from Caleb's garden and baked goods Sarah made in the early morning hours before Grace woke. The money wasn't much, but she opened a bank account in her own name and watched the balance grow with fierce pride. Each deposit was proof that she could stand on her own feet, that Dorothy's prophecies of failure were just more poison she didn't have to swallow. The farmhouse had shifted around her, becoming less Caleb's space and more a shared home. Her coffee mug had a permanent spot by the sink. Grace's toys scattered across the living room floor. The guest room had transformed into a nursery with curtains Sarah had sewn herself, yellow fabric printed with small sunflowers that caught the morning light. Marcus had built Grace a wooden high chair, and she sat at the dinner table now, smearing sweet potatoes across her face, while the men laughed and told stories about their day. Miguel taught Sarah Spanish words, Luna for the moon. Grace pointed at through the window, Estrella for the stars. James grumbled that the baby had better manners than most adults he knew, which everyone understood was the highest compliment he could offer. And Caleb. Caleb had become something Sarah couldn't quite name. Not a replacement for Ethan, that would be impossible and wrong, but a steady presence, a partner in the daily machinery of living. They moved around each other with easy familiarity now, their conversations ranging from the mundane, propane tank needs refilling, to the meaningful. Grace said something that sounded like Mama yesterday, and Sarah had cried. On a crisp October afternoon, with leaves skittering across the porch and the smell of apple cider simmering on the stove, the Buick returned. Sarah saw it from the kitchen window and felt her stomach clench with old fear. But Grace was tugging on her pant leg, demanding attention with the tyranny of almost toddlers, and Sarah realized something had changed. Dorothy couldn't hurt her anymore. Not really. The worst had already happened, and Sarah had survived it. This time, Dorothy knocked. Caleb answered the door, his body blocking the entrance, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to speak with Sarah." Dorothy's voice was different, smaller somehow, stripped of its usual armor. "Please." Caleb glanced back at Sarah, who stood in the kitchen doorway with Grace on her hip. The question in his eyes was clear. "Do you want this?" Sarah nodded slowly. She handed Grace to Marcus, who'd emerged from the barn at the sound of the car, then walked to the door. Caleb stepped aside but didn't leave, positioning himself nearby like a sentinel. Dorothy looked older. The 4 months had carved new lines around her mouth, added grey to her temples that even expensive dye couldn't fully hide. Her black dress had given way to navy blue, still mourning but softer. Her hands clutched a small gift bag with tissue paper poking out the top. "I came to apologize." The words seemed to cost her something. "For what I said. For what I did. I was wrong." Sarah waited, saying nothing. Apologies were easy. Words cost nothing. "I brought something for Grace." Dorothy held out the bag with shaking hands. "It was Ethan's, his baby blanket. I thought she should have it." Inside the bag, wrapped in careful folds, was a soft blue blanket worn thin with age and washing. Sarah touched it gently, feeling the texture of history and loss woven into every thread. This wasn't just an apology. This was Dorothy offering a piece of her son, admitting that Grace deserved to know where she came from. "I want to be in her life," Dorothy continued, her voice cracking. "I want to be her grandmother. I know I don't deserve it. I know I was cruel and hateful and—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as tears tracked down her carefully powdered cheeks. "I was drowning in grief and I dragged you under with me. That's not forgivable. But I'm asking anyway." Sarah looked at the broken woman before her and felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. Like a door that might open someday, if Dorothy was willing to do the work of earning trust, back one painful step at a time. Before she could respond, Caleb spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience and loss and hard-won wisdom. "Forgiveness doesn't create home, Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at Dorothy with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't cruelty either. "Sarah and Grace have a home here. They're safe here. They're wanted here. You can't just walk back in and expect that to change because you're sorry." Dorothy flinched like she'd been slapped. "I'm her grandmother. Biology isn't everything." Caleb's words were gentle, but immovable. "These past months, Sarah's built something real here. She's got people who show up for her, who help with the baby, who don't ask for anything except her company at the dinner table. That's family, not blood, not obligation, just people choosing each other every day." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain, but release. He was right. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she hadn't fully seen what she'd found. A chosen family built on kindness rather than duty, on respect rather than ownership. We're almost at the end of Sarah's incredible journey. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal. Stories like this need to be told, and your support makes that possible. Thank you for being here. "I need time," Sarah finally said to Dorothy, her voice steady. "If you want to be part of Grace's life, it has to be real. No conditions, no trying to control us, and it happens here, where we feel safe." Dorothy nodded, mascara streaking her cheeks, her perfect facade completely shattered. "Whatever you need, however long it takes." She left the blanket and drove away, her Buick disappearing down the gravel drive like a ghost finally released from haunting. Sarah stood on the porch with Caleb, watching the dust settle, Grace's delighted squeals echoing from inside where Marcus was probably making silly faces. "You really meant that," Sarah said quietly. "About this being home." Caleb looked at her, those green eyes warm in the golden afternoon light. "I never say things I don't mean." The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the fields, a dove called its evening song. Inside, Grace laughed, pure and joyful, and completely unaware of the complicated adult world swirling around her innocent existence. Sarah realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since before Ethan died, because Caleb was right. Home wasn't the house on Maple Street with its painful memories and conditional love. Home was here, in this moment, surrounded by people who'd chosen to care for her when they didn't have to. People who saw her at her lowest and decided she was worth lifting up. The truth settled into her bones with quiet certainty. Sometimes the truest family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one that welcomes you when everyone else has turned away. And that was worth more than any bloodline could ever be.